Chapter 1. The Lie of Eternity. He has died before. Not once, not twice, but so many times that death itself has forgotten his name. Steel through the heart, fire in the lungs, the void ripping him apart molecule by molecule. And still, he stands. The Imperium does not speak of this. It cannot, because the moment this truth is understood, the Imperium fractures. The Imperium teaches a single, sacred lie, that the Emperor is unique, that immortality is divine, that eternity belongs to him alone. Perpetuals shatter that lie with their existence. They are not blessed by the throne. They are not saints. They are not miracles. They are accidents of reality. Men and women who do not stay dead, who regenerate not through prayer, but inevitability, who rise again without warp pact, without sorcery, without demonic chains. They do not return screaming. They do not glow. They simply continue. And that terrifies the Imperium more than any Xeno's empire ever could. Because if immortality can exist without divinity, then the Emperor is no longer singular. He becomes precedent. Perpetuals predate the Imperium. This is the first truth buried beneath 1,000 layers of dogma. Before the Imperium had banners, before Terra was unified, before the Emperor crowned himself master of mankind, they already walked. They lived through Old Night, through the collapse of human civilization, through the age when Terra burned under techno-barbarian kings and gene-wrought warlords. Some were soldiers, some were scholars, some were monsters wearing human skin. All of them watched humanity fall and rise and fall again. And unlike the Imperium saints, they remembered everything. Memory is their curse. They remember worlds that no longer exist, languages erased from reality, stars that burned out before the Imperium ever mapped the sky. They remember the Emperor before he was worshipped, not as a god, but as a man. This is where the danger begins, because Perpetuals knew him when he bled. They fought beside him when he was still shaping his vision, not enforcing it. They argued with him, defied him, walked away from him, and some feared him. The Imperium claims the Emperor was always destined to rule, always inevitable, always right. Perpetuals know better. They saw him hesitate. They saw him compromise. They saw him choose survival over morality. They know the Imperium was not born holy. It was constructed, brick by brick, corpse by corpse, lie by necessary lie. Perpetuals do not fit into imperial theology. They cannot, because the ecclesiarchy needs death to be final, martyrdom to mean something, sacrifice to end in silence. But Perpetuals return. Every execution becomes meaningless. Every burning becomes temporary. Every punishment becomes theater. You cannot threaten a Perpetual with death, and you cannot control what you cannot threaten. That is why they are erased from Scripture, why records contradict themselves, why names vanish mid-sentence in sealed archives. Not because they are rare, but because they are inconvenient. Some Perpetuals served the Emperor willingly, others opposed him quietly. A few turned away in horror when they saw what his dream required, because immortality brings perspective, and perspective kills faith. They saw the Great Crusade not as salvation, but as consolidation. They saw compliance not as unity, but as extinction of alternatives. They understood something most mortals never could, that the Emperor was not saving humanity from chaos. He was choosing which future was allowed to exist. This is the truth the Imperium does not want understood. If Perpetuals exist, then the Emperor is not divine by nature. If the Emperor is not divine by nature, then his authority is constructed. If his authority is constructed, then it can be questioned. And nothing threatens the Imperium more than a question that survives execution. Perpetuals are walking contradictions. They prove eternity does not require worship. They prove survival does not require obedience. They prove the Emperor is not alone. That is why they disappear. That is why their stories end abruptly. That is why even the Inquisition speaks of them in fragments. Because once the lie cracks, faith collapses behind it, and the Imperium cannot survive truth. The galaxy is vast. Time is longer than empires. And somewhere, still breathing, still watching, they endure. Not as gods, not as heroes, but as witnesses. And witnesses are always dangerous. The silence has already begun. Chapter 2, What Does Not Belong. It begins the same way every time. A body breaks. Bones collapse inward. Organs fail. The nervous system goes dark. And then, nothing ends. No soul pulled screaming into the warp. No final breath. No judgment. The flesh remembers itself. That is what a perpetual is. Not immortal by blessing. Not preserved by technology. Not sustained by the warp. They reset. Reality itself refuses to let them finish. The Imperium pretends this is a miracle. It is not. A miracle implies intent, design, purpose. Perpetuals are none of these. They are flaws in the universe's accounting. Human beings whose biological, psychic, and metaphysical components refuse to agree on when death is final. The body dies. The mind fractures. The soul does not leave. And so the system reboots. Again, and again, and again. This is where chaos recoils. The warp understands corruption. It understands bargains. It understands possession. It does not understand refusal. Perpetual souls do not drift. They do not dissolve. They do not fracture cleanly. They anchor, even when killed by demons, even when consumed by warp fire, even when erased down to scorched atoms. They come back, not unchanged, never unchanged, but intact. This is why perpetuals are hunted, not publicly, not officially, quietly, because their existence exposes something no faction wants acknowledged. They prove the soul is not owned, not by the Emperor, not by chaos, not by the warp. That makes them heretical by nature. The Imperium teaches that the soul belongs to the Emperor. That faith binds it. That loyalty protects it. Perpetuals disprove this simply by breathing. They survive without faith, without prayer, without obedience. Some despise the Emperor. Some abandoned him long before Terra was unified. Some walked away when the Great Crusade began to taste like genocide instead of salvation. And yet, they still return. The Emperor does not reclaim them. The warp does not claim them. Death does not finish them. They belong nowhere. This is why they are called dangerous. Not because they cannot be killed, but because they cannot be placed. The Imperium is a machine built on categories. Loyal, traitor, human, Xenos, heretic, saint. Perpetuals fit none of them. They are human, but not mortal. Faithless, but not damned. Ancient, but not revered. They are a question the Imperium never solved. So it buried the question instead. Many perpetuals hide. They learn early that survival requires anonymity. They change names, faces, worlds. They let civilizations rise and collapse around them like tides. Some become scholars. Some become soldiers. Some become executioners who stop caring whether their actions matter, because they have watched too many empires fail. Others break. Immortality does not make one strong. It makes one tired. Because death is not the worst part. Memory is. They remember every failure, every betrayal, every promise broken by time. They remember humanity before the Imperium. They remember when Terra was divided but alive. They remember when choice still existed. That is why many Perpetuals did not support the Emperor's vision. Not because it was weak, but because it was final. The Imperium claims it is eternal. Perpetuals know better. They have lived through eternities before. They know empires rot from the inside long before they fall. They know what comes after unquestioned authority. Silence, stagnation, extinction wearing a crown. Some Perpetuals tried to warn him. Others tried to stop him. A few helped him anyway, because survival sometimes feels more important than morality when you have watched the alternative fail too many times. But none of them worshipped him. They couldn't. You cannot worship someone you remember arguing with. You cannot deify someone whose doubts you witnessed. That is the true threat, not their immortality, their memory. They remember the Emperor before the throne, before the myth, before the lies were necessary. They remember him as a man making decisions, and that memory alone is enough to fracture an empire built on divine certainty. This is why the Imperium erased them, why records vanish, why testimonies contradict themselves, why even mentioning Perpetuals feels like touching a wound the galaxy agreed not to reopen. Because if they are real, then the Emperor is not singular, not inevitable, not unquestionable, and faith cannot survive that realization. Perpetuals do not threaten the Imperium with armies. They threaten it with context, and context is lethal. Chapter 3. Those who walk beside him. He was not alone in the beginning. That is the lie the Imperium fears most. Before the banners, before the crusade, before the Emperor became a symbol too large to contradict, there were others who walked at his side. They were not primarchs, not generals bred for obedience, not demigods shaped to conquer. They were peers, Perpetuals. They did not kneel. They argued. They questioned his plans, challenged his assumptions, warned him about the cost of unity enforced by annihilation. And for a time he listened. This is never spoken of, because it reframes everything. The Emperor was not a solitary genius, guiding a blind species. He was one voice among several immortals who had survived Old Night in different ways. Some believed humanity needed control. Some believed it needed choice. Some believed it should be left to rise or die on its own terms. The Imperium chose one philosophy and buried the rest. These Perpetuals saw the Emperor's vision forming in real time. They watched him abandon diplomacy when compliance was faster. They watched him decide that extinction was acceptable if it prevented chaos. They saw the moment the dream hardened into doctrine, and that is when many of them left. Not in rebellion, in silence, because immortals understand something mortals do not. You don't fight inevitability head-on. You step aside and let it collapse under its own weight. Some Perpetuals remained close, not out of faith, but out of calculation. They believed that guiding the Emperor from within was safer than opposing him from without. They helped design early governance, early military doctrine, early enforcement mechanisms. They watched the pre-March project begin, and some of them recoiled, because the Primarchs were not collaborators. They were tools. Perpetuals understood what that meant. Tools can be broken. Tools can be replaced. Tools do not question. They had done those roles themselves once, and rejected them. The Primarchs were something different. They were loyalty engineered at the genetic level, and once that existed, Perpetuals were no longer needed. This is when the purge began. Not violent, not immediate, administrative. Records altered, names removed, access denied. Perpetuals found themselves excluded from councils they once shaped. Orders stopped coming. Invitations vanished. The Emperor did not strike them down. He outgrew them. That is worse than betrayal. It is obsolescence. Some Perpetuals left Terra forever. Some embedded themselves into human populations, choosing to watch instead of rule. Some grew bitter. A few grew dangerous. Because immortality paired with resentment becomes something far worse than tyranny. The Imperium later reframed this absence as destiny, that the Emperor always stood alone. that he needed no equals. That disagreement never existed, but Perpetuals know better. They remember conversations erased from history. They remember standing in rooms where the future of humanity was argued, not decreed. They remember when the Emperor could still be convinced. And that memory is intolerable, because it means the Imperium was not inevitable. It was chosen. Some Perpetuals returned during the Horus Heresy, not out of loyalty to the Emperor, but out of fear of what would replace him. Chaos was not misunderstood by Perpetuals. They had seen it before. They knew what happens when the warp becomes a guiding principle instead of a threat, so they intervened where they could, quietly, surgically, without banners. And when the Emperor fell, when the Golden Throne became a life support engine instead of a seat of command, Perpetuals understood the final truth before anyone else did. The Imperium would never evolve again. It would only endure. Some Perpetuals mourned him, not as a god, as a man who chose certainty over growth. Others felt relief, because stagnation, while cruel, is predictable, and immortals value predictability. That is why none of them stayed loyal forever. You cannot stay loyal to something that no longer listens. You cannot serve an empire that cannot change. You can only survive it. Perpetuals did not betray the Imperium. They outlived its ideals, and that is unforgivable. Chapter 4. Why he let them live. He could have ended them. That is the truth buried beneath every denial. The Emperor had the means, the knowledge, the ruthlessness. If Perpetuals were truly a threat from the beginning, they would not have survived him. Yet they did, for a long time. And that is not mercy. That is strategy. In the age before the Imperium, the Emperor was not yet absolute. He was powerful, but not alone. Visionary, but not unquestioned. Immortal, but not singular. Perpetuals were proof of that. And more importantly, they were useful. They remembered old night in ways no mortal archivist could. They remembered failed human empires, failed utopias, failed tyrannies. They were living data, advisors who had seen the end of civilizations that believed themselves eternal. The Emperor listened to them then, because he had not yet decided that survival justified everything. Perpetuals helped him map humanity's mistakes. They warned him about over-centralization, about worship replacing governance, about fear being a poor foundation for unity. They spoke of cycles, empires rising, empires freezing, empires collapsing under the weight of their own certainty. The Emperor absorbed all of it, and then he ignored the parts that threatened his conclusion, because he believed he had found the answer none of them had. Control. Total. Permanent. Enforced. The Imperium was not built to flourish. It was built to last. And Perpetuals, with their long memories and inconvenient doubts, were a liability to that design. Still, he did not kill them. Not yet, because Perpetuals possessed something he lacked. Perspective without urgency. They did not fear time. They did not rush toward solutions out of desperation. They could afford patience. And patience is dangerous to a man trying to force history forward. The Emperor feared stagnation, but he feared delay even more. He believed humanity stood at the edge of annihilation, and that only decisive, irreversible action could prevent extinction. Perpetuals questioned that premise. They had seen humanity survive worse. They had seen adaptation without domination. They were living proof that endurance did not require absolutism, and that contradiction gnawed at him. So he changed tactics. He did not erase them. He isolated them, removed them from decision-making, cut them off from influence. Let time and distance do what violence might not. He believed they would fade, or retreat, or become irrelevant. He underestimated immortals. As the Imperium grew, Perpetuals became observers rather than architects. They watched compliance burn worlds, Watch the Primarchs enforce unity through annihilation. Watch dissent become heresy. And they began to understand something the Emperor refused to accept, that his solution carried the seed of its own death. This is when fear entered the equation. Not fear of Perpetuals as weapons, but fear of them as witnesses. Because as the Imperium hardened into dogma, Perpetuals became walking contradictions. They remembered alternatives that had been erased. They remembered conversations no longer permitted. They remembered a time when obedience was not sacred. That memory could not be allowed to spread. Yet killing them posed a problem. Perpetuals do not stay dead. Execution becomes spectacle. Containment becomes temporary. Erasure becomes impossible. So the Emperor chose the only viable solution: silence. Perpetuals were not hunted openly. They were denied resources, denied legitimacy, denied history. They were written out of humanity's self-image. Not enemies, not martyrs, just nothing. And then came the heresy, and everything broke. In the aftermath, the Emperor no longer ruled. He endured. The Golden Throne locked him into stillness. And with that stillness came the final realization: Perpetuals would outlast the Imperium itself. Not because they opposed it, but because they were no longer invested in it. This is why he feared them in the end. Not because they could overthrow him, but because they would be there after him, remembering. Chapter 5, when eternity curdles. It does not happen all at once. No single betrayal. No final scream. Just time. Too much of it. Immortality does not grant wisdom. It grants exposure. Exposure to failure repeated until hope erodes into habit. Exposure to cruelty until empathy dulls. Exposure to survival until morality begins to feel inefficient. This is what the Imperium never understood. A Perpetual does not become dangerous because they cannot die. They become dangerous when they stop caring who else does. At first, most Perpetuals try. They help rebuild. They advise. They intervene quietly. They save worlds that will forget them. They protect people who will never know their names. And then those worlds burn anyway. Again, and again, and again. They watch civilizations repeat the same mistakes with religious devotion. Power centralizes. Dissent is crushed. Fear replaces trust. And someone always insists this time it will be different. It never is. For mortals, this cycle is invisible. They die before the pattern completes. Perpetuals see the whole spiral, end to end, over and over. This is when something breaks. Not the body, the purpose. Some Perpetuals withdraw. They isolate themselves on forgotten worlds, lose themselves in research, in art, in meaningless routines that make time pass faster. They stop intervening, because intervention changes nothing. Others radicalize. If humanity cannot learn, then it must be managed. If freedom always leads to extinction, then choice is a flaw. If faith is inevitable, then it should be engineered. These Perpetuals do not oppose tyranny. They perfect it. This is the truth the Imperium will never admit. Some of its most brutal ideas did not come from the Emperor. They came from tired immortals who had seen too much failure to believe in mercy anymore. And then there are the worst ones. The ones who decide humanity is a failed experiment. Not evil, not corrupt, just obsolete. These Perpetuals do not hate mankind. Hatred requires emotion. They feel nothing at all. They observe humanity the way a scientist observes bacteria, with detached curiosity. They test. They push. They see how much pressure civilization can take before it collapses. Because collapse, at least, is honest. Chaos is not their temptation. Chaos is too emotional, too indulgent, too loud. Perpetuals who break this way do not seek gods. They seek final answers. This is why even chaos fears them. Demons feed on desire. on fear, on obsession. A perpetual who has lost belief feeds nothing. They cannot be tempted by eternity. They already have it. Some of these broken immortals sided against the Emperor during the heresy, not out of loyalty to Horus, but because they believed the Imperium deserved to fall. Others worked against both sides, ensuring the war dragged on, ensuring no one truly won, because stalemate is the safest outcome when extinction lurks on either side. And some still walk the galaxy now, unseen, unrecorded, pulling levers that no longer have labels, toppling regimes, preserving others, deciding, quietly, who deserves to survive another millennium. This is the final horror. Perpetuals are not united. They are not loyal. They do not share a creed. Each one becomes their own empire of judgment, and you cannot outweight them. The Imperium understands this on some level. That is why Perpetuals are not given rank, not given command, not given legitimacy, because authority plus eternity creates something worse than a tyrant. It creates permanence. The Emperor believed he could shoulder that burden alone, that only one immortal should decide humanity's fate. Perpetuals prove that was never true. Chapter 6. The Hunt That Never Ends. It never begins with an order. There is no decree sealed with the Aquila, no public writ, no announcement carried by Vox or Scripture, because the moment the Imperium admits it is hunting something, it admits that something exists, and Perpetuals are not supposed to exist. So the hunt is silent, administrative, fragmented, disowned, a data irregularity flagged by a scribe who dies of old age before understanding what he found. A battlefield report with the same man is confirmed dead across 3 centuries. A black ship log noting a psychic signature that reappears after confirmed termination. Patterns without labels. Warnings without names. At first, the Imperium tried execution. It always does. A bolter round to the skull. Fire. Dismemberment. Total bodily destruction. The reports were clean. Then the subject reappeared. Sometimes days later. Sometimes years. Sometimes centuries after the execution order had been archived and forgotten. The Imperium learned quickly. You cannot execute what does not conclude. The next phase was escalation. If death failed, perhaps obliteration would succeed. Perpetuals were atomized, reduced to ash, cast into stellar furnaces, launched into the void without protection. Every method bought time. None solved the problem, because the flaw was not physical. It was existential. Reality itself refused to finalize them. That was when the Imperium made its most important shift. It stopped trying to end Perpetuals, and began trying to delay them. Containment replaced execution. Not prisons. Tombs. Stasis crypts buried beneath forgotten installations. No-field sarcophagi engineered to suppress soul cohesion. Blackstone vaults designed to confuse the metaphysical mechanics of rebirth. Perpetuals were not restrained because they were violent. They were restrained because they were inconvenient. Some were buried alive. Others sealed mid-regeneration, their bodies frozen between states, neither alive nor dead. A few were dismembered and stored separately, each fragment isolated in separate facilities so no single failure could restore the whole. This was not cruelty. It was procedure. The Imperium justified this quietly. Perpetuals could not die. Therefore, confinement was not murder, only postponement. Centuries in stasis were considered acceptable collateral. Time, after all, was infinite to them. But the Imperium forgot something fundamental. Time is only infinite if systems remain intact, and the Imperium is the least stable system ever created. Records rot. Administrative archives are rewritten every few millennia. Entire data vaults are lost during wars that never make it into history books. Coordinates drift. Facilities are reassigned. Security protocols are forgotten by successors who no longer understand why a vault exists at all. Some Perpetuals are not freed by strength. They are freed by clerical error. A tech priest reactivates a sealed complex looking for Archaeotech. A hive city expands downward into forbidden strata. A planetary governor repurposes an ancient black site as a storage depot. And something wakes. The Inquisition knows this. It fears it, because it means the hunt is never complete. Different Ordos respond differently. The Ordo Hereticus views Perpetuals as doctrinal contamination, living proof that the Emperor is not metaphysically unique. They favor indefinite confinement, isolation, sensory deprivation, silence as a weapon. The Ordo Malleus worries about something worse, not Perpetuals themselves. But what happens if Chaos learns how to anchor a demon to a soul that cannot leave? An immortal host, a possession with no expiration. That possibility keeps entire conclaves awake for centuries. The Ordo Xenos has its own suspicions. Some Inquisitors quietly wonder if Perpetuals are not human at all, if they are evolutionary remnants, proto-human anomalies, or something older, left behind by forces humanity never understood. These theories are sealed, discussed once, then buried. There's no unified doctrine, which means there's no final solution. Sometimes the Imperium chooses a different path. Recruitment. This is the most dangerous option. A Perpetual is offered protection, resources, identity erasure, safe passage, in exchange for silence, and service. At first, these arrangements work. Perpetuals are useful. They cannot be threatened with death. They can operate in environments no mortal survives. They endure interrogation, torture, warp exposure far beyond acceptable thresholds. They become agents of impossible longevity. But contracts decay. Handlers age, die, are replaced by successors who inherit authority without context. Eventually, someone reviews the file and asks the inevitable question, why are we protecting this? That is when the cycle resumes. Containment orders are issued. Allies become jailers. Trust collapses into protocol. And the Perpetual learns, again, that cooperation only delays the inevitable. Some Perpetuals accept capture. This is the most unsettling category. Not the violent ones. Not the defiant ones. The tired ones. They do not resist. They step into stasis willingly. Because after enough centuries, stillness feels like mercy. A sealed tomb is quieter than the galaxy. No wars. No screaming. No watching civilizations destroy themselves in predictable patterns. Just silence. But silence never lasts. Machinery degrades. Power grids fail. Wars shake foundations. And eventually, the tomb opens. This is why the Imperium cannot win. Because Perpetuals are not enemies in the traditional sense. They are remainders. Leftover variables the system never resolved. The Imperium believes itself eternal. Perpetuals know better. They have lived through eternities already. They have seen empires declare themselves final. They have seen those empires fossilize into irrelevance. They have seen memory rot faster than stone. The hunt continues not because Perpetuals attack the Imperium, but because the Imperium cannot tolerate witnesses who outlive its narrative. This is the final irony. Many of the Imperium's containment doctrines were designed with Perpetual input centuries ago. Early no-field theory, temporal suppression models, long-term psychological isolation protocols. The jailers were trained by prisoners who had not yet been locked away. And so the cycle persists. Capture, containment, forgetting, escape, again, and again, and again. The Imperium tells itself this is control, that the threat is managed, that centuries of silence equals success. But silence is not victory. It is latency. Perpetuals are not gone. They are buried. They are waiting. Waiting for entropy. Waiting for negligence. Waiting for the Imperium to do what it always does best. Forget why something mattered. Chapter 7. Those who stayed. They were not forced. That is the sin history cannot forgive. They were not broken, not coerced, not deceived by prophecy or fear. They stayed by choice. When others walked away from the Emperor, when Perpetuals who had argued, advised, warned, and doubted finally withdrew into the long anonymity of the galaxy, these remained. They looked at what the Imperium was becoming and decided it was necessary. Not good, not just, necessary. They understood the cost. That is what makes them worse than fanatics. Fanatics believe. These Perpetuals calculated. They had seen humanity fracture itself 1,000 times before. Seen freedom rot into tribal war. Seen choice dissolve into extinction. They had watched old night consume worlds that refused unity. And so, when the Emperor chose absolutism, they did not recoil. They nodded. They did not worship him. They never did. They respected him as the only being ruthless enough to do what they believed survival required. The Emperor did not need faith from them. He needed alignment. These Perpetuals became the scaffolding beneath the Imperium's cruelty. They did not lead armies. They did not wear crowns. They did not stand on balconies addressing crowds. They stood behind doors, behind councils, behind sealed chambers where decisions were translated into annihilation. They were the ones who said, yes, burn the world. No, there will be no reconstruction. Erase it, completely. They framed genocide as mathematics. If 1 billion die now, 10 billion survive later. If one culture vanishes, the species endures. They did not argue morality. They argued efficiency. Because immortals do not think in years. They think in epochs. These Perpetuals helped shape compliance doctrine. They understood how populations break, how fear spreads faster than truth, how rumor destabilizes more efficiently than orbital fire. They taught the Imperium something terrifying, that terror works best when it is predictable, not random cruelty, structured inevitability. The Great Crusade did not merely conquer, it disciplined, and these Perpetuals ensured that discipline became systemic, not emotional, not excessive, optimized. When the Primarchs were unleashed, these Perpetuals supported the project, not because they admired the Primarchs, but because they understood tools. Primarchs were finite, bound by loyalty engineered into their genes, replaceable in theory, if not in practice. Perpetuals were not. And immortals understand that immortals are the greatest threat to any system, including their own. Some of these Perpetuals advised the Emperor to distance himself from others like them, not out of fear, out of foresight. Too many eternal witnesses create instability. Too many long memories fracture narrative. Better one immortal tyrant than many immortal skeptics. Then came the Horus heresy, and the universe punished them for their certainty. The heresy was not a surprise to Perpetuals. They had predicted fracture long before it happened. What shocked them was how it happened. Not rebellion, but betrayal from within the engineered heart of loyalty itself. Some of these loyal Perpetuals tried to stop it, not by saving Horus, not by warning Primarchs, but by controlling outcomes. They sabotaged logistics, redirected fleets, delayed decisive engagements. They were not choosing sides. They were preventing conclusions, because an immortal understands something mortals never grasp. A decisive victory ends possibility, and possibility is the only thing that keeps extinction at bay. They did not want Horus to win. They did not want the Emperor to crush him completely either. They wanted stalemate, endurance. A bleeding Imperium was preferable to a dead one. or a perfected one. When the emperor fell, when the golden throne became a prison instead of a command seat, these perpetuals faced the consequence of loyalty. They had backed a system that could no longer evolve, a machine locked into survival mode forever. Some doubled down. This is where the true horror begins. They helped entrench dogma. Faith replaced governance. Scripture replaced adaptability. The emperor became myth because myth does not argue back. They told themselves this was temporary. Immortals always do. Others broke. Not loudly. Quietly. They realized too late that they had helped construct an empire that fed on humanity to survive. An Imperium that could only endure by consuming its own future. They did not rebel. They simply withdrew, carrying guilt heavier than any chain. The Imperium never recorded their names, because it could not decide how to classify them. They were not saints, not traitors, not heroes. They were accomplices. Some were later hunted, not because they turned against the Imperium, but because they knew too much. They remembered design decisions that contradicted doctrine. They remembered that the Imperium was not sacred. It was assembled. Others still operate in the shadows, embedded in administrative layers, inquisitorial subclades, forgotten advisory roles that persist only because no one remembers why they exist. They keep the Imperium from collapsing completely and ensure it never heals. This is their final punishment. Eternity spent maintaining a system they know is broken, holding the line, not because it deserves to exist, but because they cannot bear to see what replaces it. They stayed, and by staying, they damned themselves, because loyalty, when informed, is not virtue. It is responsibility. Chapter 8, The Throne That Never Speaks. The silence did not arrive with violence. There was no final order. No last command broadcast across Terra. No moment where the galaxy understood that something essential had ended. It arrived the way Rod does. Quietly, gradually, inevitably. The Emperor did not die. That distinction matters. The Golden Throne still burned with impossible intensity. The Astronomicon still carved its bleeding path through the warp. Humanity's fleets still crossed the void, guided by his agonized presence. To the Imperium, this meant survival. To the Perpetuals, it meant entrapment, because the Emperor no longer acted. He endured, and endurance is not leadership. Before the heresy, the Emperor was dangerous because he responded. He adjusted strategy when reality shifted. He abandoned doctrines when they failed. He rewrote plans without sentiment or apology. He was not merciful, but he was adaptive. That adaptability was his greatest weapon, and when he was bound to the throne, that weapon was lost. The Golden Throne did not elevate him. It froze him. To Perpetuals, beings who understand time not as years, but as eras, this was the moment the Imperium truly began to die. Not at Istvan, not at Terra, but in the instant humanity lost its last capacity for correction. The throne reduced the Emperor to function, maintain the beacon, anchor the warp, endure pain beyond comprehension. Nothing else. No guidance, no revision, no dissent, just output. The Imperium mistook this for divinity, because mortals fear uncertainty more than cruelty, and silence invites interpretation. Faith rushed in to occupy the void he left behind, not through conspiracy, not through rebellion, through necessity. Humanity could not survive 10,000 years of horror without meaning. So meaning was manufactured from suffering. The Emperor's pain became sacred. His immobility became holy. His silence became approval. Perpetuals watched this transformation with something deeper than fear. They watched it with recognition, because they had seen it before. They had watched kings become gods once they stopped answering questions. They had watched tyrants sanctify the moment they became unreachable. They had watched silence mistaken for perfection across 1,000 dead civilizations. This pattern never ended well. Before the throne, the Emperor rejected worship, not out of humility, out of strategy. Gods cannot adapt. Gods cannot admit error. Gods cannot change course without shattering belief. And stagnation was the one thing he feared more than chaos. Now he had become exactly what he opposed. A God-shaped absence, sustaining an empire that no longer understood its own purpose. The Imperium, after the heresy, was not ruled. It persisted. Orders continued because they had always continued. Wars were fought because no one remembered how not to fight them. Worlds burned not because someone chose to burn them, but because the system defaulted to fire. This was the shift Perpetuals noticed immediately. Before, atrocities were decisions. After the throne, atrocities were procedural. No council weighed consequences. No authority questioned necessity. The machine simply ran, grinding populations into fuel, grinding faith into obedience, grinding time into dust. Perpetuals understood the danger instantly, because systems without feedback do not correct. They metastasize. Some Perpetuals tried to intervene, not loudly, not openly. They knew how the Imperium reacted to visible dissent, so they worked quietly. They attempted reform through logistics, introduced flexibility into doctrine, adjusted protocols to reduce catastrophic overreaction. Small changes, measured changes, the kind that saved civilizations over centuries. They failed, not because they were wrong, but because the Imperium no longer recognized why things existed, only that they must continue. The High Lords did not oppose them. Opposition requires awareness. Instead, bureaucracy absorbed them. Proposals disappeared into endless review cycles. Initiatives stalled in committees that had authority without agency. Reforms were diluted until they meant nothing. The Imperium did not reject change. It made change impossible. Others attempted something far more dangerous. They tried to reach the Emperor himself, not through prayer. Perpetuals do not pray. They sought proximity. They believed, perhaps foolishly, that fragments of his will remain intact, that the Emperor was not silent, merely distant, that guidance could still be extracted. They approached the throne, and found nothing. No voice, no directive, no recognition, only pain, endless, mechanical, unfocused. This broke something fundamental, because if the Emperor could no longer guide humanity, then all authority derived from him was hollow, a chain of command anchored to absence. Perpetuals began to understand the true horror of the Golden Throne. It was not preserving humanity. It was locking it in place. A living empire evolves. A frozen one decays slowly enough to mistake itself for eternal. Faith hardened rapidly. Without a speaking emperor, interpretation became power. Priests replaced planners. Ritual replaced reason. Obedience replaced responsibility. The ecclesiarchy did not rise through ambition. It rose through vacuum. People needed meaning, needed reassurance that suffering mattered, needed to believe 10,000 years of blood had purpose. The throne did not correct them, so belief filled the silence. Perpetuals watched doctrine calcify into law, and law harden into inevitability. This terrified them more than chaos ever had, because chaos destroys, faith preserves. Some Perpetuals reached a conclusion they hated. The silence must be maintained, not because it was just, but because it was stable. If the Emperor awakened, the Imperium would shatter. He would not accept what humanity had become. He would not tolerate worship built on his agony. He would not hesitate to correct 10,000 years of failure. That correction would be catastrophic. If the Emperor died, the Astronomicon would fail. Warp storms would consume the stars. Humanity would fragment overnight. Both outcomes meant extinction. So only one state remained survivable: endurance. The throne must burn. The emperor must suffer, because suffering maintains equilibrium. This realization destroyed many perpetuals. Some withdrew entirely. Some broke. Some drowned themselves in distraction. Others accepted it coldly, because immortals understand trade-offs. A few embraced it. These became the most dangerous. They began to act as custodians of stagnation, preventing reform that would destabilize belief, preventing collapse that would fracture humanity, preventing awakening that would trigger annihilation. They were not loyalists. They were wardens. The Imperium believes it is ruled. In truth, it is managed by beings who understand that survival no longer means progress. It means delay. This is the Perpetuals' punishment: to maintain a system they know is broken, to protect a lie they understand better than anyone, to preserve an empire that can never heal. And through it all, the throne never speaks. The Imperium interprets that silence as divine approval. Perpetuals know the truth. Silence is not consent. It is absence. And absence, stretched across eternity, becomes catastrophe. Chapter 9. The day he rises. The hope never dies. That is the cruelest thing about it. Across the Imperium, in cathedrals carved from the bones of continents, and shrines raised atop ash fields where civilizations once breathed, the same prayer is whispered. Billions of voices, fractured by distance and fear, speak the same forbidden longing. One day he will rise. They imagine it as salvation, as light flooding the void, as judgment falling only on the enemies of mankind. Perpetuals do not share this hope. They fear it with a clarity that borders on dread, because they remember the Emperor awake. They remember his movement, not the radiance, not the symbolism, the speed, the way decisions formed faster than councils could convene, the way outcomes mattered more than intentions, the way entire philosophies were discarded the instant they proved inefficient. The Emperor was never dangerous because he was powerful. He was dangerous because he was decisive. Mortals believe resurrection would mean mercy. Perpetuals know better. They understand that mercy is a luxury of uncertainty, and the Emperor has never been uncertain. Before the Golden Throne, the Emperor was not static. He evolved. He refined doctrine the way a blade is honed, by removing material, not adding it. He abandoned strategies without regret. He shed allies when they became liabilities. He was not cruel for cruelty's sake. He was cruel when cruelty was efficient. That is why his return terrifies them, because the Imperium, as it exists now, is inefficiency made sacred. Imagine the moment, not in myth, not in prophecy, in reality. The Emperor awakens, not confused, not weakened, not blind, but aware. Aware of 10,000 years of worship he never sanctioned. Aware of a priesthood that turned his agony into divinity. Aware that humanity replaced responsibility with obedience and called it faith. Aware that his name has been used to justify stagnation. Perpetuals know what happens next. Assessment. The Emperor does not mourn failure. He corrects it. He would look upon the Imperium and see a machine that still runs, but no longer functions. A civilization that endures, but does not progress. An empire that survives by consuming its own future. A species that chose ritual over understanding, because ritual is easier to obey. The Imperium believes he would preserve it. Perpetuals know he would dismantle it. Completely. Not out of malice. Out of necessity. The Emperor's original vision was never comfort. It was alignment. Humanity unified not by belief, but by enforced stability. Protected from chaos not by fear, but by structure. Freed from gods by becoming unnecessary to them. That vision failed. Spectacularly. And failure, to the Emperor, is not sacred. It is unacceptable. Resurrection would not mean a return to the Great Crusade. It would mean something worse. A second correction. Perpetuals understand what correction looks like at that scale. They saw it on Terra during unification. They saw it during the early Crusade, when resistance was erased without negotiation. Entire cultures extinguished because they slowed progress. Languages burned because they fractured unity. Beliefs erased because they invited chaos. Multiply that across 10,000 years of rot. That is what resurrection means. Faith would not be debated. It would be annihilated. The ecclesiarchy would not be reformed. It would be purged. Not for heresy, for inefficiency. Trillions would die. Not in war, in restructuring. Worlds deemed too indoctrinated to salvage would be cleansed. Populations incapable of adaptation would be erased. Institutions built on myth would be dismantled violently, not because they are evil, because they no longer serve survival. The Emperor would not ask if humanity was ready. Readiness is irrelevant to necessity. Perpetuals know this because they have seen him act when the cost was unbearable, but the outcome was inevitable. They remember his expression when making such decisions. Not rage, not joy, resolution. This is why Perpetuals fear his return more than his death. Death ends suffering. Resurrection restarts intention. Some Perpetuals fear something even darker, that the Emperor would not return as he was. 10,000 years on the Golden Throne is not stasis. It is transformation, endless psychic strain, constant war pressure, unimaginable pain focused through a single, immortal consciousness. Not corruption, but refinement. The Emperor was already more than human. What remains after 10,000 years of agony would be something else entirely. Something colder, more focused, less restrained by the remnants of empathy he once possessed. Perpetuals fear he would return with no tolerance left, no patience, no memory of why mercy was ever considered. A being that no longer questions whether survival is worth the cost, only whether the cost has been paid efficiently. This is why some Perpetuals work to maintain the Golden Throne, not out of loyalty, out of containment. They do not want him dead. If the throne fails, the Astronomicon dies. Warp storms swallow the Imperium whole. Humanity fractures overnight. They do not want him awake. Awakening means correction. Correction means extinction. So they choose the only stable state left. Endurance. The Emperor must suffer, because suffering maintains equilibrium. This is the truth Perpetuals rarely speak aloud. They have accepted that his agony is the price of survival, not because they are cruel, but because they have measured every alternative and found them worse. Some Perpetuals hate themselves for this conclusion. Others accept it with cold resignation. A few take comfort in it, because it absolves them of hope. The Imperium prays for salvation. Perpetuals pray for delay. They sabotage extremes. They prevent reforms that would destabilize belief too quickly. They prevent collapses that would fracture humanity outright. They prevent resurrection that would trigger annihilation. They are not rulers. They are moderators of extinction. This is the final irony. The Emperor sought to save humanity from gods. Now humanity is saved only because he has become one and cannot act. Perpetuals understand this paradox better than anyone. They live inside it. They know the Emperor's return would not herald light. It would herald clarity. And clarity, applied without mercy, is extinction. That is why they fear the day he rises. Because when he does, there will be no debate, no revision, no second chances. There will only be correction, and silence afterward. Chapter 10, when salvation is abandoned, the decision is never announced. There is no oath spoken, no declaration carved into stone. No moment where the galaxy understands that hope has been set aside. It happens quietly, the way frost creeps across iron, the way stars burn out without sound. Perpetuals do not give up on humanity all at once. They arrive there. At first, they tell themselves the Imperium can be corrected. That stagnation is temporary. That fear can be unwound. That belief can be replaced with understanding. They try. They always try. They intervene subtly. A war diverted before it consumes an entire sector. A purge delayed just long enough for evacuation. A doctrine softened so it kills millions instead of billions. Small victories. Invisible ones. But immortality teaches a brutal lesson. Small victories do not accumulate. They reset. Every generation repeats the same patterns with religious devotion. Power centralizes. Fear replaces trust. Obedience becomes virtue. Violence becomes default. And the Imperium applauds itself for enduring. Perpetuals watch this cycle repeat until pattern becomes certainty. Not pessimism. Certainty. They watch innovation punished as heresy. Curiosity burned as corruption. Compassion framed as weakness. They watch children raised to die believing suffering is holy. They watch entire worlds erased because flexibility was considered dangerous. And slowly, realization forms. Not emotional, analytical. Humanity is no longer trying to survive. It is trying to remain unchanged. That is when salvation becomes impossible. Perpetuals understand this better than any mortal ever could, because they have seen civilizations survive catastrophe. They have seen worlds adapt after near extinction. They have seen cultures reinvent themselves after collapse. Those civilizations did not worship endurance. They embraced change. The Imperium does not. It fears it. Chaos did not destroy humanity's future. The Imperium sealed it. This is the moment some Perpetuals stop asking how to save humanity and begin asking whether it should be saved at all. Not out of hatred, out of exhaustion. They have lived through the same mistake too many times. Watched the same justification repeated with different banners. Listened to the same arguments for necessary cruelty dressed in new language. They know the script, and they know how it ends. Humanity will not evolve willingly. It will not reform voluntarily. It will not abandon faith while faith still functions as control. So some Perpetuals make a different calculation, a colder one. If the Imperium cannot change, then it must end. This does not mean genocide. Not immediately. Perpetuals are not berserkers. They are planners. They begin preparing for after, not the fall of a world, the fall of a species-wide system. They establish sanctuaries far beyond imperial reach, not colonies, vaults, places stripped of symbolism, ritual, and myth. Populations selected not for loyalty, but for adaptability. Scientists who still question. Engineers who still innovate. Children raised without scripture burned into their skulls. These enclaves are small, deliberately, scalable only if necessary. They see data, true histories, unedited records, accounts of old night, accounts of the emperor before the throne, not as propaganda, as reference. They prepare technologies the Imperium would burn, not weapons, systems, self-sustaining infrastructures, non-warp navigation experiments, cultural frameworks that do not rely on worship to maintain cohesion. They do not call this rebellion, because rebellion implies the Imperium is still the future. They call it continuity. These Perpetuals do not plan to overthrow Terra. They plan to outlast it. They know the Imperium will fall. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but through attrition, through accumulated inefficiency, through stagnation finally collapsing under its own weight. They prepare for the moment when the Astronomicon flickers, for when warp routes fracture, For when imperial authority becomes local mythology instead of law, they are not waiting for the emperor to rise. They are waiting for the throne to fail. This is the most heretical truth of all, not because it denies divinity, but because it accepts inevitability. Some perpetuals go further. They believe humanity itself is no longer viable, not biologically, ideologically. They see a species that has chosen fear over growth so completely that survival has become self-defeating. They see no path where humanity emerges intact, only paths where something else rises from its ruins. These perpetuals do not plan sanctuaries. They plan successors, hybrid cultures, post-human frameworks, civilizations not bound to Terran identity. They do not care if it is still called humanity. Names are irrelevant. This is where even other perpetuals recoil, because here lies the final line. To abandon the Imperium is heresy. To abandon humanity is something worse. Yet immortality breeds perspective, and perspective kills sentiment. These perpetuals ask a question no mortal would dare ask. If humanity's defining trait is self-destruction, is preserving it moral? They do not answer quickly. They do not answer unanimously. But some answer yes. They begin long experiments, subtle genetic divergences, cultural isolation tests, societies raised without the concept of divine authority. They watch, they wait, because perpetuals do not rush. They have time. The Imperium never sees them. It is too busy burning itself alive in ritual. The Inquisition senses something. Ghosts in the data, patterns of absence, worlds that vanish without record. Not purged, just gone. They hunt, but they do not understand what they are hunting, because this is not rebellion. It is succession planning. This is the final betrayal, not against the Emperor, against the idea that humanity must be eternal. Perpetuals know better. Nothing is eternal. Not empires, not species, not gods. Survival does not mean preserving what exists. It means allowing something new to replace it. This is what some perpetuals are preparing for. Quietly, patiently, without banners. They are not villains. They are not saviors. They are archivists of extinction. And when the Imperium finally collapses, when the throne falls silent for the last time, they will not mourn. They will begin. Chapter 11, when the masks fall. It does not begin with revelation. There's no grand unveiling. No signal sent across the stars. No moment where the Imperium suddenly understands. Understanding is a luxury of stability. This begins with failure. A system goes dark and does not return. A sector's tithe fleet vanishes without wreckage. An inquisitorial cell follows a lead that simply ends. No heresy uncovered. No cult exposed. Just absence. At first, the Imperium treats this as it treats everything else. As an error. Administratum clerks mark entries for later review. Naval cartographers redraw routes. Inquisitors blame rivals, then chaos, then Xenos. None of the explanations fit, because this is not invasion. It is withdrawal. Perpetuals are not striking. They are stepping forward. For millennia, they learned the Imperium's blind spots. They learned how bureaucracy loses memory faster than flesh. How authority diffuses responsibility until no one can act. How fear narrows perception. They learned where to hide. And now they stop hiding. Not openly. Not proudly. They simply stop pretending. Some abandon false identities they wore for centuries. Others cease answering orders that no longer make sense. A few speak truths they once buried under silence. Not proclamations. Corrections. An inquisitor receives a report contradicting 10,000 years of doctrine and finds it backed by records older than the Imperium itself. A cardinal's miracle fails when its subject refuses to die again. A space marine kills a man confirmed executed 5 centuries earlier. At first, the Imperium reacts with rage. It always does. Accusations of heresy flood the Vox. Purges are ordered. Entire populations are burned to erase anomalies. But the anomalies return, unbroken, unashamed. This is when panic begins, because the Imperium understands something is wrong, but not what. Perpetuals do not announce themselves as a faction. They never would. They understand that banners invite annihilation. Instead, they do something far more destabilizing. They contradict. They contradict scripture with memory. They contradict history with lived experience. They contradict authority with survival. They do not argue. They simply exist. And existence, when it refuses to obey the rules, becomes heresy by default. The ecclesiarchy calls them blasphemies. The Inquisition calls them threats. The administratum calls them irregularities. None of these labels solve the problem, because labels require containment, and perpetuals cannot be contained indefinitely. Some are captured. This still happens. The Imperium has not forgotten its habits. They are bound in null fields, sealed in blackstone, buried beneath facilities whose coordinates are known only to the dead. The Imperium tells itself the problem is handled. Again, then the vaults fail, or are opened, or are forgotten, and the perpetuals return. This time, they do not flee. They remain. They speak, not to crowds, but to individuals. A governor who still remembers doubt. A Muggos whose curiosity was never fully burned out. A commander who has seen too many worlds die for reasons no one can explain. They do not preach rebellion. They offer context. They tell these individuals what the Emperor once said, what he once believed, what he feared. They tell them the Imperium was never meant to worship, that stagnation was never the goal, that survival was meant to be temporary. Most refuse to listen. They must. Listening would destroy them. But some hear, and hearing is enough. This is when the Imperium's greatest weapon fails. Fear. Fear requires uncertainty. Fear requires the possibility of death. Perpetuals remove both. You cannot terrorize what does not end. You cannot threaten what will return. You cannot martyr what refuses to stay dead. The Imperium begins to realize it is not fighting enemies. It is fighting witnesses. The High Lords order suppression at a scale unseen since the heresy. Records are burned. Archives sealed. Entire branches of knowledge erased. They believe they are erasing perpetuals. They are erasing proof. Too late. The idea spreads faster than the truth ever could. Not that perpetuals exist, but that the Emperor was not alone. That he was not singular. That he was not inevitable, that the Imperium is not eternal. That thought fractures loyalty more effectively than any demon ever has. Civil unrest does not explode. It hesitates. Orders are questioned. Executions delayed. Compliance slowed by doubt. The Imperium begins to choke on its own rigidity. Some perpetuals finally step into the open, not to rule, to end the illusion that no alternatives exist. They reveal archives long thought myth, technologies deemed impossible, histories that contradict sacred narrative, not as weapons, as options. This terrifies the Imperium more than rebellion ever could, because rebellion can be crushed. Options cannot. The Inquisition fractures internally. Some double down, purging even loyal worlds for proximity to doubt. Others hesitate. A few defect. Not publicly, but permanently. Space Marine chapters begin to argue. Quietly. Not about loyalty. About meaning. Because Astartes were made to serve a vision. And if that vision was flawed, what are they now? This question spreads. It is never answered. Perpetuals do not push further. They do not need to. Entropy is doing the work. The Imperium was built on certainty. Remove certainty, and the structure collapses inward. The galaxy does not erupt into chaos. It slows. Systems stop responding uniformly. Orders lose authority as distance increases. Local rule replaces imperial decree. Not rebellion. Fragmentation. Perpetuals watched this without triumph. They knew this would happen. They prepared for it. Their sanctuaries activate. Their archives unlock. Their successors step forward. Not conquerors, curators. This is the moment the Imperium finally understands. Not what Perpetuals are, but what they were preventing. For 10,000 years, Perpetuals did not fight the Imperium. They buffered it. They absorbed instability. They delayed collapse. Now they stop. The Imperium calls this betrayal. History will call it inevitability, because no empire survives being witnessed by those who remember before it existed. The masks fall, not with thunder, with silence. Chapter 12, What Remains. The galaxy does not end with fire. That is the lie of apocalypse, that endings are loud, decisive, merciful in their clarity. The truth is quieter. Things simply stop answering. A beacon flickers, and no one knows when it first dimmed. A warp route grows unstable, not catastrophically, but inconsistently. A world misses a tithe cycle and is not punished, because no one remembers who was meant to punish it. The Imperium does not fall. It thins. Perpetuals have seen this before. They recognize the signs the way mortals recognize hunger. Empires do not collapse when their enemies strike hardest. They collapse when their systems forget why they exist. For 10,000 years, the Imperium survived by insisting it was eternal. That insistence became its final weakness. The Golden Throne still burns. That is the cruel irony. The Emperor does not die when the Imperium begins to dissolve. He remains suffering, anchoring, enduring. A God-shaped constant, sustaining a structure that no longer coheres around him. The Astronomicon still shines, but fewer ships reach their destinations, not because the light is gone, but because fewer worlds answer it. Perpetuals watch this with no satisfaction, only recognition. They have watched stars die this way before. The ecclesiarchy screams louder as its authority weakens. Faith intensifies when certainty erodes. Cathedrals grow taller. Rituals grow bloodier. Martyrdom becomes cheaper. But faith cannot restore coherence. It can only preserve obedience. The Inquisition fractures. Not publicly. Internally. Some cells purge without discrimination, believing terror will reassert order. Others quietly stop issuing orders at all. A few abandon Terra entirely, convinced the center can no longer hold. They do not defect. They disappear. Space Marine chapters receive conflicting commands. They obey none of them fully, because warriors engineered for clarity cannot function inside contradiction. Some chapters entrench, becoming local tyrants in all but name. Others withdraw to their fortress monasteries, sealing themselves away from a galaxy they no longer recognize. A few shatter entirely, splintering into warbands loyal not to Terra, but to memory. This is not civil war. Civil wars require a shared identity worth fighting over. This is something else. Fragmentation. Perpetuals understand that this was always the likely outcome. The Imperium was never designed to adapt indefinitely. It was designed to endure long enough for chaos to be beaten back, long enough for humanity to stabilize, long enough for the Emperor to finish his work. That work never finished, and so endurance became the goal instead of the means. That inversion doomed everything. The Emperor does not awaken. This surprises many Perpetuals. Some feared it, some hoped for it, some prepared for it obsessively. But the throne remains silent, whether by choice or by failure. The Emperor does not rise to judge what humanity has become. Perhaps he cannot. Perhaps he will not. Perhaps he understands, in the depths of unending agony, that awakening would destroy more than it saves. If so, then the Emperor's final act is restraint. And restraint in this galaxy is indistinguishable from absence. Perpetuals accept this, because acceptance is the last luxury of immortality. The Imperium continues to exist, but only as an idea, a shared myth held unevenly across 1,000 fractured domains. On some worlds, the Aquila still commands obedience. On others, it is a relic hung on walls no one remembers how to salute. Tithes become symbolic, edicts become suggestions. Terror becomes distant in more ways than distance. The High Lords still rule. They simply rule less, and less, and less. Perpetuals do not accelerate this process. They do not need to. Entropy has taken over. They turn their attention elsewhere, to the vaults they built quietly, to the enclaves seeded with possibility instead of obedience, to populations raised without the reflex to kneel. These places are not utopias. Perpetuals know better than to attempt perfection. They are adaptive, messy, argumentative, alive. Mistakes happen. Wars still occur. People still die. But death is not sacred, and that alone changes everything. Some enclaves fail. Perpetuals record the reasons. Others thrive. Perpetuals suggest parameters. This is how civilizations actually survive, not through faith, through revision. The Imperium labels these places heretical when it notices them at all, but labels no longer carry universal weight, because there is no longer a universal center to enforce them. Chaos does not triumph. That is another lie. Chaos thrives on excess, on obsession, on extremes. A fragmented galaxy offers fewer unified emotions to feed on. More noise, less resonance. The warp grows unpredictable, but always was. The difference is that fewer people pretend it is manageable through dogma alone. Xeno's empires expand into the gaps left behind. Some are violent, some are pragmatic, some are simply curious. The galaxy does not belong to humanity by default anymore, and humanity, finally, must contend with that reality. Perpetuals do not mourn this loss of dominance. They never believed dominance was sustainable. Only coexistence is. Time passes. Centuries. Millennia. The Imperium becomes a historical era rather than a living system. Scholars in distant enclaves debate its merits without fear of execution. They argue whether it saved humanity or merely delayed extinction. They never reach consensus. That too is progress. The Golden Throne still burns, but fewer remember why. Eventually, the question arises, not loudly, but inevitably. What happens when it fails? Perpetuals have considered this question for longer than anyone else. They have no singular answer, but they have prepared. Some believe humanity will fracture irreparably. Others believe new forms will emerge. A few believe extinction is still the most likely outcome. They do not argue. They wait, because waiting is what immortals do best. The Emperor remains, not as a god, not as a ruler, as a boundary condition. A final, agonized constant holding the warp at bay while the galaxy rearranges itself around his suffering. Perpetuals understand the cost of this better than anyone. They know what is being spent, and they know that one day, even that expenditure will end. When it does, there will be no grand finale, no last battle, no closing hymn. The warp will surge. Some worlds will vanish. Others will adapt. Life will continue, because life always does. This is the final truth perpetuals carry. Not hope, not despair. Continuity. Gods fail. Empires rot. Species change or vanish. But memory, true memory, is the only thing that gives meaning to survival. Perpetuals are not saviors. They are not villains. They are witnesses who chose not to lie. And when the Imperium finally fades into history, not with a scream, but with a long, quiet forgetting, they will still be there, recording, adjusting, continuing. The galaxy does not care who ruled it, only what endures. And when the stars dim, and the throne finally falls silent, and humanity becomes something else, no one will remember the Emperor as a god. He will be remembered as a decision. And decisions, like all things, end. He did not vanish. He was remembered by nothing. When the silence came, it did not end the story. It proved there was never a final chapter to begin with.